Hi, I'm Mike from 1A Auto. We've been selling auto parts for over 30 years.
Hey folks, we've got these brand new front CV axles for our 2008 Outback here with an automatic transmission. These are from TRQ. You can buy them at 1aauto.com. They are brand new. There's no core charge on these. Direct fit, direct bolt in. These will work great for you, fit great, and keep you on the road. Before we raise and support this vehicle, we're gonna use a 19mm socket. These wheels are kind of tight. Some of these are chrome, thin-walled socket, so it fits better. The thicker impact socket didn't want to fit. But I will use the breaker bar, and we're going to loosen these lug nuts while the vehicle is on the ground. It makes that a lot easier. The wheel doesn't spin on you. Just go around, loosen them all. So now these are all loose. Oh, that one's not quite loose, so I'm going to make sure. There we go. We're going to raise and support the vehicle using our 2-post lift, but you can use a jack and jack stands. Use the socket to finish taking off the lug nuts and remove the tire and wheel. I'll hold on to the wheel and tire. As I loosen this lug nut, I don't want it to fall. Take it off, put it aside. Before we can remove this axle nut, it's staked in place to the axle. There's no cotter pin on this particular design. So we're going to take a punch, and we're going to try to bend that out away from there so that it will spin off. You can either use a punch or sometimes very carefully a flat-bladed screwdriver, which is I think what I'm going to put in there. Just be careful using a flat-bladed screwdriver for this. They're not really meant for this type of job, but it's probably what you have on hand. So I'm just going to tap this out a little bit and just gently bend it out. And you'll get to a point where it bends out and it'll eventually just spin free. And that's probably good enough right there. You just don't want it to be folded into the cutout in the axle, otherwise it won't spin. Once you get it kind of past it and you start to spin it, it'll round itself out. And we're not going to reuse this nut. The axle comes with a new one, so if it's all torn up and destroyed, that's fine. This axle nut is 32mm, so you'll need a big socket like this to remove it. A couple different ways you can remove this axle nut, because as soon as you go to turn this, as it sits right now, it's going to want to spin the whole assembly and it'll be hard to loosen. So you can take a punch, if you have that, you can slide it into the vanes of the rotor and hold it so when you go to turn it off, it stops it from spinning. You could have a friend sit in the car and step on the brakes really hard. That would also work. Or one method that I really like, especially if you're working on a jack and jack stands, because these can be on with a lot of torque, these axle nuts, and when you go to use a breaker bar, you can upset the car and it might fall off the jack stands. I like to take the wheel, and you can just take your punch or the end of your hammer and just pop the center cap out. It pops right out. You can reinstall it onto the hub. Put a couple lug nuts in. You don't have to put them all in, but just enough that the wheel is held on there. So probably 3 is fine. And we're just going to lower it back down to the ground, and we'll use the weight of the car and the tire, and that's how I'm going to break the axle nut free. So we'll take our socket and we'll put it through. Sometimes these axle nuts can be torqued to 150 foot-pounds. And they can be rusty. This one, we're lucky, is not very rusty, so they can be really hard to take off. So I like using this method where the car's on the ground. It's not gonna, the potential for it to fall off the jack stands is not there, and you can put a whole bunch of weight on it with your breaker bar to break that free. That one wasn't too bad, but some of these can be really, really tough, especially if you've never replaced the axle before, you've never had the hubs off. This car, we've done some work to it already. And it's been apart at least, but if you've never had it apart, this is probably your best method to get it apart. So I'm going to loosen up that nut just a bit. I don't want to take it all the way off. And now I can put the car back up in the air, raise and support it, and I will take the wheel off. So now I'll loosen these 3 lug nuts I had on here and take the wheel and tire off again. Lucky for us, this has been apart before. We just didn't swap out the axle. So one thing you want to make sure before you get too far in disassembling and moving your knuckle out of the way is that this CV axle will slide out of the hub assembly. It's threaded here, that's how it drives the wheels. So you can push on it and see if it moves. This one moves really easily, which is awesome. But if it doesn't want to move, you're going to want to spray. You can even take this nut off here. You're going to want to spray rust penetrant into here, into where the splines are. And then you can put your nut back on, because you don't want to damage the end of the axle, especially if maybe you want to reuse it. Then you can hit it with a dead blow and make sure that it comes free of these splines. And the reason why you want to put the nut back on here is that if you don't have a dead blow and say you're hitting it with a metal mallet, you could potentially damage the end of this CV axle and mushroom it out, and then it'll get stuck in here, or you won't be able to reuse it, you won't be able to get the nut off. It'll be a big mess. So you can either use a dead blow, or if you don't have a dead blow, you can put a punch into that center part. This one's a little big for it, but you can just tap it like that and break it free. So those are a couple tips to get stuck CV axles free. Before I remove the strut bolts, I'm going to remove the bolt holding on the ABS wire. It's a 12 millimeter. I'm going to use a 12 millimeter socket extension and a ratchet. Loosen it up. And I'll put the bolts right back in here so I don't lose it. I'm going to do the same thing to the brake hose on the other side of the strut. There's also a 12 millimeter bolt. Just slide it out, put it aside, and I'll put the bolt right back in. Before I remove these bolts, I'm going to mark where the strut is to the knuckle using a felt tip pen. And this is because the upper bolt is an eccentric bolt and you can adjust your camber with it. So you'll either want to make sure that you've marked it in the original place to get it as close as possible, or you may have to have the car aligned afterwards because your camber will be off. So just be aware that when you remove these, your camber can come out of adjustment. I'm going to use a 19 millimeter wrench on the bolt head and a 19 millimeter socket and a breaker bar on the nut side of it. I'm going to turn on the nut side of it. Get it broken free. It's nice and loose. And I'll work on the bottom one the same way. Now just to speed removal, I switched to a short extension and a ratchet with the 19 millimeter socket. I'll just spin this off. And actually, as it gets looser, I'll probably just take it off with my fingers. I might have to push the whole knuckle assembly a little bit and work the bolt out. The top one is the eccentric bolt. And then the bottom one is a regular bolt. See if I can push it out. If it doesn't come out easily, like that one, you might have to tap it out. Just carefully just tap it out. Wiggle it a little bit, get it loose. Sometimes you lift up, that'll help. Let this come down, we'll push the strut off. Now I left this nut on so it doesn't pull the axle out. So I'm going to take the nut off. I'm going to carefully lower this down, push the axle out of it. Kind of maneuver the axle out. Slide it out this way. I have to move this around a little bit. Carefully around this hose. And there's the axle. Just be careful because these are hanging. They're kind of resting on the ball joint. So now I've got that free. What I'm gonna do, put a bungee cord around this, just take some weight off of it, hook it up to the strut. There we go. You wanna have a drain pan handy because when you pop this axle out, you may have some of the transmission. So this is the differential gear oil. This is not transmission fluid. Transmission fluid is here in the pan on this automatic. So some of your differential gear oil may leak out and you might have to top it off afterwards. And we'll show you how to check that. Carefully take the pry bar and go up between the transmission case and the CV axle. I'm gonna hold on to the axle and I'm gonna pop it out. And now I'm gonna guide it straight out. There's our old CV axle. Here we have the CV axle we pulled from our vehicle. And this is the brand new one from 1AAuto.com. There's no core in this. It comes with a new axle nut. There's a little protective plastic here on the threads that go into the transmission. You can pull that off. You can see it's the exact same length as the one we took out. It has a little dust shield, and this will fit great and work great in your vehicle. So I'm going to guide the new CV axle in, and I might have to hand over hand it here. I just want to be careful when I go in to the transmission that I don't damage the seal. So try to center it, and you might have to turn it at the same time to get the splines to line up. And then it should just kind of get in there. And then I'm going to take my dead blow hammer and just hit it home a little bit till it seats. Perfect. Take the axle nut off. So now we just need to maneuver the axle. I'm gonna actually undo this bungee cord. Leave it there for now. You have to bend the axle shaft just a little bit, and then we're gonna feed it into the hub. And kind of get it lined up, and you can push it up. You might have to turn it a little bit, turn the hub a little bit. I think that's locked in place, and it should start to slide in. There it is. The strut spun on me. So I want to kind of push the knuckle up into the strut too at the same time. Let's take the axle nut and just thread it in there by hand. This way it doesn't slide back out on me. I can take the lower strut bolt and get it started in here. And sometimes you can lift up on this. If you need to use a jack, you can, but this one's pretty good. Get it in place, just kind of push it through. And the camber bolt goes on the top. You can tell because it's got this little hump to it. It's eccentric. And kind of wiggle it in, put it in place. Capture the two nuts. I'm gonna use the socket and ratchet, and I'm just gonna tighten down this axle nut just to pull it in. I'm gonna torque it. Once it gets tight, I'll just stop. I'm gonna come back and torque it once it's on the ground. So you can see this top bolt is a camber bolt. And you kind of see that line that I made. And as you turn this, it pulls the knuckle in or out, adjusting the camber. So I'm just gonna get to the point where it lines back up with the line that I made. If there's any doubt about your alignment, just have your car aligned. To tighten this, I'm gonna hold the bolt because I don't want the bolt to spin out of adjustment. And I'm just gonna work on tightening the nut. It might be loose enough. Yeah, I'll tighten this down with my fingers, and then I will snug it up with the ratchet and socket. And that's good for now. I'll torque it afterwards, but now I'm gonna snug up the lower one. So while I've got the car sitting here, I'm gonna reinstall the bracket with the ABS wire and as well as the brake line. So we'll take our bolt, put it back in here, thread it all the way in, use my 12mm socket, and I'll just tighten it up. You don't have to kill it. Once you feel it get tight, just stop. I'll put the brake line back in here, take the bolt out. Tighten it up. Okay, I'll just snug this up, and when it gets tight, I'll stop. There we go. And if you used a bungee cord, don't forget to take it off of your strut spring. We're going to hold the head of the bolt with our 19mm wrench and then torque the nut to 112 foot-pounds. Once it clicks, you're all set. We'll do the same for the other one. We're all set. So to torque this axle nut, you can have someone hold the brake for you. You could put a punch in the brake rotor like this, or you could put the wheel back on like we did to remove it. I'm going to show you this method of tightening it. So we're going to get it in here so it doesn't spin. Put a punch in there. So whichever way you feel more comfortable doing this, that's fine, but you do want to make sure that this axle nut gets torqued to 162 foot-pounds. Otherwise, you could ruin your wheel bearing or this nut could come loose. It's not good. So take our torque wrench and the axle nut socket. And once it clicks, you're all set. Take this out of here. Before you put your wheel on and head on down the road, you want to make sure that you stake this axle nut because it doesn't have a cotter pin. It needs to be punched over into that slot into the CV axle. So you can actually turn it to get to a spot where you can reach it better. And then we'll take a punch and our hammer, and we're going to punch it into that opening. And that's it. That's perfect, just like that. The axle nut now can't spin off because it's locked in place. We'll put the wheel and tire back on. Thread your lug nuts on by hand. Get them started. And I'll use the socket. Thread them down. Get them pretty tight by hand. With the vehicle on the ground, we'll torque the lug nuts in a cross pattern. The torque range is between 74 to 89 foot-pounds, so I'm going to go with 80. Start over here. Once it clicks, you're all set. And of course, if you took your center cap off, it just pops back into place. We finished up installing the passenger side CV axle. If we move over here to the driver's side, it's just a mirror image of it, so the procedure will be exactly the same. If you did lose fluid out of the differential of the transmission, there's a yellow dipstick right there. You can pull that out and check the fluid level and also add fluid into there. So I'm going to reach down and grab it. It's going to be hard to see because I'm kind of in the way. Pull this out. Kind of buried down in there. So we'll look at it. Put it back in. So you can actually see it's just below the full line. I wouldn't add any to it because you'll overfill it. But if it was at the low line, between those two, might be like a quart. You just add it a little bit at a time until you get it up to that full line. And you'll just need a long funnel to get down in there. But I guess we got lucky with this one. Nothing dripped out when we took the axle out, probably because we had the car level. If you've got the car jacked up to one side, you might have some come out, but that's how you check and top off the transmission differential. So you don't want to add to the transmission fluid because it is separate from the transmission differential. It's gear oil. It's totally different stuff, just the way this Subaru is set up. I'll put the dipstick back in and we can close our hood and the job is complete.
Thanks for watching. Visit us at oneauto.com for quality auto parts, fast and free shipping, and the best customer service in the industry.